So next we'll have our second keynote speech by Henry Fernandez. Henry is chairman and CEO of MSCI Inc. He became head of MSCI business in 1996 and then led the company through its IPO in 2007. In 2009 and 2019 and 2021, Henry was one of 30 executives named in the Barron's list of the world's best CEOs. And one thing we should know that under Henry's leadership, MSCI index include China A share. So welcome, Henry Fernandez.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that kind introduction. I would like to also thank George and everyone at the China Institute for inviting me to participate in today's event. I would like to welcome Ambassador Chen Li to this great city, which is a world of itself for sure. And hopefully we can develop, as Bob said, a good personal and professional relationship. It's a true honor for me to appear alongside so many distinguished scholars, policymakers, and business leaders. And while I do not have extensive government experience of somebody like my friend Bob Hormats, I do have a bit of a long-term perspective on the rise of China, and I look forward to sharing a few of my thoughts. In light of last week's U.S. elections, our topic, of course, could not be more timely and important. Before I talk about U.S. China relations, I thought I would give you a little bit of my own personal connection to this issue. Over the past 45 years, I have made countless trips to mainland China, and I have visited more than a dozen cities in the country. In fact, I was there for 2 weeks, visiting 5 cities in the early part of the summer, and I'm back in Beijing next week, meeting with our clients and government officials to try to continue to develop the agenda of modernization, opening up, and collaboration in the capital markets of China and the rest of the world. My first trip there was in 1979 when I was 21 years old. I had always been fascinated by China ever since I was a young man growing up in Nicaragua, Central America, the deep south. In the summer of '79, I had already read pretty much everything that the Western press was writing about Deng Xiaoping and the reforms that started in late '78. And I thought that was going to be world-changing. And I had just graduated from Georgetown University in economics and geopolitics. And I couldn't wait to go and spend some time there. So I went and I spent probably about a month or so. And in those days, people like me were not allowed to go to the northern part of China, Beijing, Shanghai. You could only stay in the south, so I did that. At the time, I was very unsure about what my career path would be, but I knew that I wanted to see the results of this emerging transformation firsthand in China. And you can imagine what it looked like in the summer of '79. GDP per capita of China was probably $350 or so. The country had a equal distribution of income, but very poor and not very well developed. It turned out to be one of the most memorable trips that I have ever taken. My late mother, would now say that if I believe in reincarnation, I would have been Chinese in a prior life. So moreover than anything also, that trip changed my whole life. Not because of anything that happened in China, but because of what happened 9,000 miles away in my native country of Nicaragua. One day, while walking out of the famous zoo in Guangzhou, I noticed a shocking headline on the front page of the People's Daily, the English edition, of course. My home country had just fallen to a violent revolution, and people like me and my family were no longer welcome. So I immediately contacted my family, who was living, was staying in Miami, because it was so close to the United States. Right? And I asked if everyone was fine, especially my father, who was the head of the armed forces, of the country. And seemingly, overnight, I began to realize that I became a political refugee in America, and I had to reimagine my whole future. In the years that follow, I never lost interest in China, despite the fact that, I escaped Nicaragua because of a communist revolution, and China was a communist country. But I felt that it was important in the community of nations to understand each other, to understand each political system, our social organization, our aspirations and our ambitions, and try to bridge the communication gap and create progress. So indeed, I've been a witness to the evolution up close of China through my work in the finance and investment industry. In my early days while at Morgan Stanley, my boss, John Mack, who was then the CEO of Morgan Stanley, appointed me to be the expert on China, and of the capital markets of China. So back in those days, mid-90s, we did a roadshow across the country explaining the political, economic, and financial opportunities in China. Then when John Mack and his colleagues at Morgan Stanley wanted to create China Investment Capital Corporation, he asked me if I wanted to throw my hat to be the first CEO. And I said, look, I'm an immigrant in this country. I still have a lot of family, so I passed on the opportunity. And a friend of mine, the late Elaine LaRoche, was appointed, to that position. So I've been going through, clearly a lot of the ups and downs of the relationship, and for sure, the U.S. China relation today is going through a very difficult and challenging period. We all know that both Republicans and Democrats in Washington, do not agree on much, but they do seem to agree in their view that China poses a historic threat to the interest of the United States. The choices that these two countries make will determine the future of geopolitics in the world. And I also spent some time, back in the 70s, late 70s in Japan, and saw the evolution of Japan through the 80s and the 90s. And I asked myself the question that Japan and America were brutal economic and corporate competitors, during those days. They were, the Japanese auto industry was slaughtering the American auto industry, as you remember. The Japanese electronic companies, the Japanese steel companies, and all of that. Just like you may think of the Chinese auto industry today, could be a major threat to the European and the American auto industry. But, the economic and competition and the commercial competition between Japan and the United States never degenerated into a geopolitical competition, a military competition, for a lot of obvious reasons. But so I asked myself, why do we have to end up in military, geopolitical competition and potential confrontation between these two countries, despite the fact that we can be very serious and brutal competitors in the commercial, economic, and even financial world. So I'm not here to talk about the legitimate national security concerns, military concerns about these two countries or the two parties in Congress. Plenty of other speakers will address those concerns, I'm sure. My goal is to highlight the many benefits that U.S. and China engagement, some of which have become obscure in the current political environment. So it's no exaggeration, of course, that America and China represent the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. Our mutual relationship affects peace, prosperity, and economic opportunity for literally billions of people across the world, not just the people of the United States or the people of China, but people from all parts of the world. As the next U.S. administration develops its approach to China, it should start by reviewing a few basic facts that are totally unappreciated. Sometimes only one side of the ledger gets focused on in this relationship between the U.S. and China and the rest of the world. First, the growth of U.S.-China trade and investment flows has delivered significant benefit for both countries. Secondly, decoupling the United States and the Chinese economy is almost a dream that it's never going to happen. And it will not necessarily produce the results that many people expect. This is not a decoupling of the United States and the Soviet Union, which, as Bob illustrated, with the example of the early days of China, had very little trade with one another, very little relationship with one another, very little, immigration with one another, and all of that. Third, the expansion of U.S.-China educational and cultural linkages has unambiguously strengthened both countries. Fourth, none of the world's biggest challenges can be solved without U.S.-China cooperation. So let me briefly expand on each of these themes. Everyone knows that bilateral trade helped turn China into a global export powerhouse, creating untold millions of jobs and raising living standards across China and, for that matter, many parts of the world. We must not forget that it also contributed to lowering consumer prices in the U.S., especially during the first several years of this century. Again, we have to look at both sides of the ledger. Between 2000 and 2007, for example, the annual purchasing power of U.S. households increased by an average of $1,500 thanks to growing trade with China, according to research by the very own Federal Reserve of the United States and the London School of Economics. Over that same period, U.S. trade with China increased the total purchasing power of American consumers by more than $400,000 for every U.S. job that was displaced or eliminated. Let me repeat that. During that same period, 2000 and 2007, the U.S. trade with China increased the total purchasing power of American consumers by more than $400,000 for every job we displaced. So we can focus on all the jobs that have been lost by this trade and this globalization, but you gotta focus only on what is the creation of value that has existed on the other side for the rest of the population. So in other words, the positive consumer impact of China trade was very much larger than the negative, labor market impact in the country. More importantly, the consumer gains disproportionately help lower income Americans. We should also note that trade with China now supports hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of jobs in the U.S. So for us to think that we are going to impose very high tariffs to Chinese goods coming into the U.S., and that we're going to get away with that without some significant impact in our own economy is a pipe dream. Let me turn to capital flows. Opening up to U.S. companies and U.S. financial institutions have helped China build a more modern, competitive, and efficient financial system. I can tell you from personal experience, because I have led the effort for about 20 years of helping the Chinese government, the Chinese Securities Commission, opening up China to foreign capital flows through the work that MSCI does. This encouraged foreign investment and has enabled Chinese firms to access the capital they need to grow. By improving market efficiency and loosening or eliminating many of the constraints holding back Chinese businesses, financial liberalization and financial reform in China has promoted a more innovative and dynamic Chinese economy. I'd like to remind the Chinese government of that fact, because there is a tilt right now by the Chinese government away from entrepreneurs and the private sector and pro-state-owned firms that are less efficient, have created less modernization, and have created less wealth in the country. In addition, this reform and liberalization process enables Shanghai to emerge as a global major financial center. A friend of mine just sent me a picture on the Hall of Fame of the Shanghai Stock Exchange when I'm there, in the opening up of the A-share market to international investors, and it reminds me how Shanghai has evolved dramatically, from those days. So it is easy to take this progress for granted, but none of it is irreversible. It can go the other way. We can go back to darker days. In fact, many political figures in both countries now say they want to reverse this U.S. and China engagement and collaboration and erase the economic benefits of these two countries working together. In their words, they hope to decouple the U.S. and the Chinese economies. Practically speaking, as I said before, that is a lot harder to achieve than to think about. Even after years of tariffs, the COVID pandemic and other disruptions that have taken place over the last 10 years or so, U.S.-China goods trade is still totaling $575 billion in 2023. So would decoupling lead to a massive reshoring of U.S. manufacturing jobs? Will it reduce China's share of global exports and lead to deglobalization? Not necessarily. Let us consider a few recent evidence of that. China's share of all U.S. imports, meaning Chinese goods coming into the United States, did decline substantially between 2016 and 2023. However, the share of U.S. imports from other countries, especially Mexico, Vietnam, India, Thailand, has increased substantially. There's no deglobalization going on. And overall, U.S. trade deficit was still larger in 2023 than in 2016. So it has not led to a trade surplus or a trade balance in the United States. Meanwhile, China's share of global exports was larger in 2023 than it was before the pandemic. So where is the decoupling? Where is the deglobalization happening? Similarly, China's trade surplus represented a larger portion of global GDP than before the pandemic. I think I saw a headline this week that China's trade surplus may have reached $1 trillion this year. In short, decoupling would not automatically produce deglobalization, and it would not automatically benefit the United States. To be sure, the U.S. China relationship is about far more than just trade and investment. There is also an important cultural dimension. Millions of Chinese Americans live, work, own businesses, and create jobs here in the United States. On the academic side, China accounts for more of America's international students than any other country in the world, including the recent decline that we have seen of Chinese students at American universities. I'm a trustee of Stanford University, and we still see a large number of Chinese students coming to California. All of this drives U.S. economic growth and innovation. Let us cite a few examples of that. Chinese immigrants have launched more than 20 different billion-dollar startup companies in the U.S., according to the National Foundation for American Policy. They're not necessarily collecting welfare payments in America. Even more remarkably, think about this, between 1976 and 2019, so a 43-year period, nearly 3/4 of all biotech patents filed by ethnic Chinese inventors were assigned to American companies, according to the China Data Lab at the University of California in San Diego. So innovation is about overcoming challenges. And Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants have created more than their fair share of those innovations. So among those challenges clearly are to overcome this period of hostility between the U.S. and China and to try to work together. At a basic level, we cannot maintain a healthy international security environment without a stable, peaceful relationship between these two most powerful nations and powerful militaries. We're beginning to see an axis being formed between Russia, China, Iran, and places like that that is not going to be healthy to the development of peace and prosperity in the world. Nor can we reach a net zero carbon emissions without cooperation between the two largest emitters in the world. At this very moment, U.S. and Chinese officials are meeting with policymakers from around the world at the United Nations COP29 climate conference in Azerbaijan, Baku, Azerbaijan. Their goal is to accelerate global decarbonization to deal with the most perverse impacts of climate change. We will not succeed. We cannot succeed without sustained dialogue and collaboration between the world's two largest emitters. To underscore the urgency of this work, let me give you a few facts that some of you may be aware of, but it's good to refresh our memory. Scientists believe the world must limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to prevent the worst effects. Meeting that ambition would require total greenhouse emissions to fall 42% by 2030. As it stands today, even if all the countries of the world were to meet the Paris Agreement, they would only reduce emission by 10%, not 42%. We should be encouraged by what America has done and what China is doing in bending the curve of that. But we still have a long way to go, and the window is closing, and the collaboration between China and the United States is paramount about all of this. So we need to keep all of this in mind when we talk about the U.S. and China relations. We must never take the benefits of bilateral engagement and cooperation for granted. Likewise, we should never underestimate just how damaging a full-blown U.S.-China decoupling could be, even if it's hard to achieve. Given the stakes, I'd like to encourage our leaders, both in China and the U.S., to look at each other in the eye, to try to lower the rhetoric that each country is ramping up. They both talk about cooperation, they both talk about meeting and all of that, but at the same time, they're whipping up the rhetoric of their own population against each other. Sooner or later, that's not going to end well when there is a conflict or an issue. So with that, I'd like to feel that perhaps a hawkish approach by each country leads to a softening of the tensions that exist. We can only hope that these two things will happen and we will succeed for the benefit of each country and the benefit of the world at large. As I said, it's been a privilege to be here with you, to share my own thoughts about all of this, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the event. Thank you very much.